Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at medieval theology in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. What is medieval scholasticism? It's going to be a method of study that examines from all sorts of different perspectives the key theological, and we'll see later on that this is adapted not just to theological conversations, but to areas of study where it will set forth the principles of why we believe what we believe, and then seek to question and examine it from different points of view, looking at different areas that might contradict one another. It's a system and a method of study. Now, we can perhaps understand it in contrast to the monastic studies of an earlier generation, where the monastic studies had a tendency to be contemplative and literary. Scholasticism was, in its nature, more argumentative and logical. In monastic studies, it asks the question, how do I live? How do I think of God? How do I interact with society? In scholasticism, it's the question of what are the basis for my beliefs, and it might be those beliefs that take me on how I have to live. So I think there is a little bit of relationship between the two, but it's more belief oriented. In monastic studies, they accepted the authority of the abbot. In scholasticism, they questioned the various opinions. So it was a system where you say, here's what the authorities say, let's see how they interact together. What about when they seem to contradict? How can we hold these truths to be self-evident? In monastic studies, ancient texts, actually in both of these, I should say, both monastic and scholasticism, the ancient texts were seen to be authoritative. In scholasticism, they're asking, what do they mean? How do they work together when they seem to be at odds? And in both cases, it was recognized that faith is necessary to understanding. Let's begin then with Anselm of Canterbury. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, a philosopher, a theologian. He is the one who gives us the ontological argument for the existence of God. In other words, the argument for existence of God based on the very idea that we hold to the idea of God. He says, I do not try to understand in order to believe. I believe in order to understand. So notice the primacy of faith. Here's his reasoning for God. First of all, God is the greatest thing that we can imagine. If God exists only in our thoughts, then there's a greater quality that we could ascribe to him, that we could attribute to him, that quality of existence. And therefore, we would be able to conceive of a being greater than he really is. And so he reasons, but since that's absurd, then God must really exist. Next, we come to Peter Abelard. He was a French philosopher, theologian, a bit on the arrogant side. A bit is probably an understatement. He was brilliant. He knew he was brilliant. He thought everybody else should realize just how brilliant he was as well. Established his own school. Now, remember, to have a school doesn't mean that you had to have a building or a campus or anything like that. You just need the professor and the students, and he had a great many students, running up into the hundreds, if not the thousands. He writes Sic et Non, yes and no, which is a series of contrasting discussions on a number of various topics in which he would take both sides and sort of work them logically one against the other. He becomes a tutor to Eloise de Argenteau. Now, he and Eloise actually enter into an affair. They're both unmarried, and she becomes pregnant. In fact, she has a child that will be named Astrolabe after there was a astronomical device that you would use to determine the latitude that you were at. It would be used by sailors, And it was like naming somebody today Pentium chip or or computer or something like that. Um, and so they enter into affair. They are secretly married. Now you say, well, why aren't they publicly married? Because remember that one who is engaged in studies is under clerical orders, and that means it's just like a priest would be single. You're required to be single, and so it would hurt his career, and so they agreed to a secret marriage, but the word got out, especially once she had had the child, and her uncle wanted it publicized. And instead, Abelard had Eloise sent to a nunnery to sort of keep them apart. And her uncle thought this was a great affront to her dignity. And so one night he sent some of his people in. He was a leader in the community. Sent some of his servants in, and they broke into where Peter Abelard was staying, and they castrated him. This was not done in secret. The next morning, word got out all over the community, so it became very publicly known and publicly lamented. Look at what they had done to him. Well, following this, Abelard, Peter, goes into a monastery at St. Denis, and he tries to leave teaching for a time and goes and lives the lifestyle of a monk. After a while, he sort of can't help himself. He writes Ethica. This is speaking of internal versus external sins, and I'm not sure if he's using himself as an example in that. But with his continued writings, he is condemned as a heretic, and he had been, frankly, saying some things that were on the borderline there, and he's excommunicated. He'd been accused of both modalism with regard to his view of the Trinity and also Pelagianism. Two things I'm not sure about the modalism. Pelagianism, I think he probably had moved into that area. And no less a person than Bernard of Clairvaux brought charges against him. They were actually charging each other with different things. But in the case of Peter Abelard, he was actually excommunicated. And so there's a restoration. What happened is he's trying to go down to Rome. He thinks he can talk his way out of his excommunication by approaching the Pope. It's not going to happen, and he's on his way down, and he stops by the monastery of Cluny. And the abbot there says, look, enough is enough. You really don't want to do that. Why don't you just retire here? I will see about overturning the excommunication. And the abbot apparently was sort of a peacemaker, not trying to get him back into the classroom, but trying to at least restore him. And so he spends the rest of his days there in Cluny, not as a heretic, but as a esteemed scholar, but one who is past his years by now. And when he dies, he is buried alongside his beloved Eloise. A quote from him, he says, "For through doubting we come to inquiry, and through inquiry we perceive the truth according to truth himself." So for Peter Abelard, the quest was not in getting the right answers, but in asking the right questions. Now we contrast Anselm and Abelard. In Anselm, he would say, I believe in order to understand. Abelard would say, I doubt in order to understand. Notice the two very different approaches. With Anselm, he says, the debt of sin is so great that only God could pay it. This is why it was necessary for God to become man. With Abelard, he says, God brought about the atonement through the incarnation to show his great love for us. And on the surface, that sounds good. But what he's doing is he's denying the atonement. With Anselm, we have a legal theology. With Abelard, we have what he would describe as a moral theology. In Anselm's case, he says Christ's death upon the cross was a substitutionary atonement as he paid the penalty of the curse of the law on my behalf. And I want to say to that a hearty amen. With Abelard, he says, Christ's death on the cross was a demonstration of divine love that calls us to live a life of moral obedience to God. And if he said that in addition to the words of Anselm, I would have said, okay, there's a point there. But notice that wasn't in addition to, that was instead of. In Anselm's case, he becomes, in a sense, the sort of the spiritual director or father of the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Arminians, the Wesleyans, the Amyraldians. You say, what's an Amyraldian? Somewhere between a Calvinist and an Arminian, sort of in the middle there. But all of those would agree with Anselm. With Abelard, his teachings lead to eventually what will be called the Socinians, those who deny the omniscience of God and the deity of Christ. Remember how we talked about the modalism against which Abelard was accused. Unitarians and a number of religious liberals of today's ilk. Next, I want to move to Thomas Aquinas, who will be the distinctly Roman Catholic theologian. He's a Dominican theologian. He is a scholar. For some reason, perhaps because of his appearance, not because of his mind, his mentor and professor had given him the nickname the Dumb Ox. It stuck. But there was nothing dumb about him. He was a brilliant scholar. Yeah, I say that even when I don't necessarily agree with him. He brought Aristotelian logic to Christianity in a day and an age when the church fathers were, yes, they wanted to hold to the scriptures, but they wanted to bring in, remember, this Greek learning that in some cases had been rediscovered thanks to the Crusades and the interaction with Muslim writers. He writes the Summa Theologica, and it is a systematic theology. It's not the first that had ever been written, but it certainly brings this type of study to a new level. Now, Plato and Aristotle both had been, student and teacher, and yet had been seen in contrast to one another. In Plato, we see the world that we see with our senses is only a shadowy, incomplete version of the truth. Remember Plato's illustration of the cave. He imagines people that are in a cave looking not out at the world that is, but instead looking at shadows that are cast from the outside. And Plato says, when we look at the world around us, we're just seeing the shadows. We're not actually seeing reality. Aristotle, by contrast, says we make systematic observation and analysis to form logical statements about the world. And so notice two very different approaches. With Plato, we get metaphysical philosophy. With Aristotle, we get the scientific method. With Plato, he gives rise to both Anselm and Augustine. Augustine especially was very we could almost call him a Neoplatonic. In the case of Aristotle, he's going to resemble Aquinas, or I should say Aquinas is going to represent Aristotle in his approach, a detailed study of what there is, and what there is both in nature, but also what there is in the scriptures. Plato focused on what was important, even if it wasn't necessarily true. I had to chuckle about that. Aristotle focuses on what is true, even if it's not necessarily important. So again, two very distinctive approaches. In Aquinas, as he deals with the question of God's existence, he says that God's existence is, on the one hand, proven by reason, but it is known and experienced by faith. Through reason, we come to have knowledge of God's existence. Through faith, we come to the full knowledge of God. And so Aquinas lists 5 ways that we can know about truth, that we can know about God, that we can know of the existence of God. The argument from motion, we'll look at the details on that one in just a minute. But the fact that that things are in motion. For example, if you walk into, and this is my example, not his, you walk into a pool hall and you see a ball moving across the table. Even though you can't see that it happened, you can tell somebody hit something that made that ball move. Somebody caused that motion to take place. The argument from efficient cause, and notice these are all interrelated, that what is needed a cause, and the cause needed to be such that it would work to bring about that cause, whatever was that mover. The argument from possibility and necessity, and we'll look separately at that. The argument from graduation of being, and finally the argument from design. And each one of these are taken as a argument, and we're just going to highlight some of them. The argument from design just looks at the world around us, whether you're looking through a telescope or through a microscope, whether you're looking at all creation or just the very tiny things that you see. There's design in this world, very elegant design that bespeaks a designer. Aquinas says, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. Remember our illustration of the pool table. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, in other words, one thing might have hit another thing and that hit another thing, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover. If there was no first mover, then nothing would be in motion, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Anything that moves had to have something that moved it. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and everyone understands this to be God. And notice this is one of the evidences for the existence of God, God as the prime or first mover. Those truths are self-evident, which are recognized at once. As soon as the terms in which they are expressed are known, such a truth is the assertion that God exists. For by the name God, we understand something greater than that which nothing can be thought. This notion is formed in the understanding by whoever hears and understands the name God, so that God must already exist, at least in the mind. Notice when we talk about God, and even when I use that in English, it's 3 letters. I move to a different language, it might be a different word. But when I use that word God, it communicates something to the hearer, which at least in your mind exists. Now he cannot exist in the mind only, for what is in the mind and in reality is greater than that which is in the mind only, but nothing is greater than God, as the very meaning of the name shows. It follows that the existence of God is a self-evident truth, being evidenced by the mere meaning of the name. It reminds us a little bit of some of the earlier arguments that had been used. Aquinas says, to one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible. And I think he makes a good point there, that we really come to know God through faith. Now, Augustine versus Aquinas, in a sense, I'm going this versus that, but I'm really looking at 2 leaders of the Roman Church, of the Catholic Church. Augustine talks about how the state and politics, and remember in his City of God, they are a consequence of original sin. That is, we needed the organization of state and politics and nations to have a way for people to get along, because the world is a fallen place. Aquinas says state and politics are a part of the natural order, that's just the way things are, nothing to do with sin. Aquinas talks about predestination and says because of original sin, man is dependent on the power of grace for salvation. We need to be saved by grace, through faith, Augustine would say. Aquinas says, with regard to predestination, that men have to cooperate with divine grace and exercise it in order to be saved. We're going to see the Roman Catholic Church move in the direction of Aquinas rather than Augustine. Now, let me just say, when we get to the Reformers, we're going to see the Reformers saying, wait a minute, what we're saying is the same thing that Augustine was saying. So the Reformers are going to follow more, in this case at least, in the tradition of Augustine. Augustine says man cannot know anything about God unless he receives revelation from God. Aquinas says man can know about God by observing the natural world, to which Augustine would reply, but the natural world is God's revelation. Again, you look at Romans chapter 1, verse 20, and it speaks to that the things that we see are a revelation of God. It's natural revelation is natural, but it's also revelation. Now, Aquinas speaks about how a man merits an increase of grace by each meritorious action, so that initially man is given grace from God. Ephesians 2:8 is also in Aquinas' Bible. So yes, Aquinas would say, yes, you are served by grace, and then your response to that gives you merit, which gives you more grace, which gives you more merit, which now finally leads you to redemption, so that there is in Aquinas' theology, a progressive justification. When we get to the Reformers, they're going to be saying absolutely not, that justification is not progressive. Now, you can perhaps say that sanctification is progressive, but this is not even I think a good description of sanctification. Sanctification rather is something that God does. Yes, we participate in it, but with regards to justification, no, I don't participate in my justification. I'm declared righteous on the basis of what Christ did on my behalf as I trust in him. And so Aquinas is saying, yes, man cannot merit the first grace. The Reformers would say man cannot merit any grace, because then it would cease to be grace. Grace is that which is undeserved. Aquinas has the cross, in which Christ purchased salvation, but then since Christ not only merited salvation on his own behalf, he did more than enough good works, and so he has imbued into the church what we could call a treasury of merit, and that resides both in heaven, but then has been given to the church and its members to enjoy. And so by this, Aquinas sees the church being able to deposit that from that merit into the lives of its people, and therefore grant salvation. That becomes the basis for things like indulgences. And so Aquinas sees steps for salvation. By the way, I'm borrowing all of these charts from John Hanna's excellent presentation on theology and doctrines of the church. Talks about how in the beginning we have this gratuitous infusion of grace, so that initially God gives grace, but then the result is that there is a moral cooperation where you do the best you can with the aid of grace, and then at the end you finally receive the reward of eternal life as a just due of what you have accomplished. Yes, what you have accomplished through grace. But again, the Reformers are going to say, no, salvation is the result of what Christ accomplished on your behalf. Very different ideas with regard to salvation. And so, we've looked at Anselm, we have looked at Peter Abelard, we've looked at Aquinas. One we haven't examined yet, and we'll save for a future discussion, will be Peter Waldo, who will be pointing us to that grace. In fact, we could call him a pre-reformer reformer, because he's going to be one who is far earlier than the Reformation. But he will be preaching Reformed truths, and his followers will continue to hold those truths. Finally, when the Reformation comes about, his followers, the Waldensians, will say, well, we've been waiting for the rest of you. Welcome aboard.